The news reached the American jazz world in the spring of 1959, the way bad news always reached it. Through the clubs first, then the magazines, then the conversations at the bar after the last set when musicians talked about people who weren't in the room. Chet Baker had been arrested in Italy, drug charges. The details were uncertain, but the conclusion was not. Baker was going to prison, and his European career? The bookings, the recording sessions, the audiences that had received him with a seriousness that America had never quite managed, was finished. The musicians who heard the news responded with varying degrees of sympathy and satisfaction. The critics who heard it reached for their notebooks. Everyone agreed on one thing. That was the end of Chet Baker. They were wrong about almost everything except the arrest. To understand what the arrest meant, you have to understand what Europe had meant to Baker in the years before it. He had first toured the continent in 1955, arriving in a jazz world that was hungry for American musicians in a way that the American market, saturated with its own production, was not. The European audiences of the mid-1950s received jazz with an attentiveness that Baker found immediately preferable to the distracted appreciation of the American club scene. They listened. Not politely, not as background to conversation, but with the focused attention of people who had decided that what was happening on the stage was the most important thing in the room. Baker, who had always played for the music rather than for the audience, found this quality of reception clarifying. He played better in Europe. The recordings from his early European tours have a quality of ease and extension that his American work of the same period does not always match. Italy had been particularly generous. The Italian jazz audience of the late 1950s was passionate in ways that combined musical sophistication with a Latin emotional directness that Baker found congenial. They responded to his playing not with the cool, analytical appreciation of critics, but with something closer to recognition. The feeling that the music was saying something they had always known and had been waiting to hear said. Baker played concerts in Rome and Milan and Florence and smaller cities whose names he could not always pronounce, to audiences who received him as something between an artist and an event. He recorded prolifically. He was, in Italy in the late 1950s, as close to professionally content as his constitution allowed. The arrest came in March 1959. Baker was 29 years old, and the circumstances, which involved a quantity of heroin that Italian law categorized as possession with intent rather than personal use, produced a charge that the Italian judicial system processed with the efficiency it reserved for foreign nationals whose cases it wished to conclude. Baker was convicted and sentenced to a term that would keep him incarcerated through most of 1959 and into 1960. The prison was in Lucca. The trumpet stayed outside. The weeks between the arrest and the sentencing were covered by the Italian press with a prurient interest that the American jazz world then picked up and amplified. Photographs circulated of Baker being escorted by Italian carabinieri, the young, remarkable face that William Claxton had photographed in a Capitol Records studio 6 years earlier, now wearing an expression that the cameras found equally compelling, but in an entirely different register. The photographs were published in American music magazines alongside text that was careful not to express the satisfaction it clearly felt. A talent self-destructing was a better story than a talent thriving, and the American music press of 1959 was not above recognizing that fact, even when it would not have admitted it directly. The American jazz press covered the arrest with the tone it reserved for stories that confirmed existing narratives. Baker's addiction had been an open secret for years. The missed engagements, the erratic behavior, the rumors that had circulated in both the American and European music communities since his earliest professional days. The arrest was treated as an ending because it fit the ending that had always been predicted. Downbeat magazine ran a brief item. Several prominent musicians gave interviews in which they expressed concern while making their pessimism about Baker's prospects clear. The general consensus, assembled quickly and held firmly, was that the combination of incarceration, the damage to his embouchure from months without an instrument, and the reputational consequences of a drug conviction would collectively produce what Baker's addiction had been threatening to produce for years, the permanent end of his playing career. What the consensus did not account for was René Lepine. Lepine was a French music promoter in his early 40s who had been booking jazz musicians across France and Belgium for 15 years. He was not a sentimental man. 15 years of music promotion had removed whatever sentimentality he might have arrived with, replacing it with a precise and unsentimental understanding of what musicians were capable of and what they were not. He had worked with Baker twice before the arrest, booking him for Paris engagements in 1957 and 1958, and he had formed a specific opinion about what Baker was musically, an opinion that the arrest and the prison sentence and the unanimous consensus of the jazz world had not altered. Lepine visited Baker in the Lucca prison twice during his incarceration. The visits were brief and practical. He asked Baker how he was. Baker said fine in the way that Baker said everything, and Lepine told him that when he got out there would be work if he wanted it. Baker said he would want it. Lepine said good, and left. This exchange, which lasted approximately 10 minutes across 2 visits, was the entirety of the professional planning that preceded what would become one of the more significant comebacks in jazz history. Baker was released in the spring of 1960. Lepine was at the prison gate with a borrowed trumpet and a booking for a Thursday evening at the Café de la Paix in Paris, 6 weeks away. Baker took the trumpet, played one note on the street outside the prison, heard what 16 months had done to his embouchure, and said nothing. Lepine said, 6 weeks is enough time. Baker said, yes. Neither of them had any particular evidence for this, but neither of them was a man who found the absence of evidence a sufficient reason for pessimism. The 6 weeks that followed were not public. Baker practiced alone and with Lepine's loosely assembled rhythm section in a Paris apartment that Lepine had arranged, rebuilding the muscular coordination of his embouchure with the patient stubbornness of someone who has no alternative plan. The progress was real but uneven. Some days the lip responded with something close to its former capability. Other days the coordination dissolved, and what came out of the trumpet bore little resemblance to what Baker intended. He did not discuss this variability with Lepine. He practiced through it, treating each bad day as information rather than evidence. The musicians Lepine brought in for these rehearsals said later that Baker during those 6 weeks was unlike Baker in any other context they had encountered. He was punctual, which surprised them. He was focused in a way that left no room for the distraction and vagueness that musicians who had worked with him before sometimes reported. He ran the same passages repeatedly without visible frustration, which required a relationship to repetition that musicians who knew his reputation for impatience found surprising. Alain Goraguer, the French pianist who would play the Café de la Paix engagement and who was present for several of the rehearsal sessions, said that what he observed during those 6 weeks was not a musician trying to recapture something that had been lost. It was a musician rebuilding from the foundation up, with the precision and patience of someone who understands exactly what each layer of the structure requires before the next layer can be added. The Thursday evening at the Café de la Paix arrived. Lepine had not promoted the engagement beyond a handwritten card in the club window. He had made a deliberate decision not to generate expectations that Baker might not be able to meet, and also a deliberate decision not to make the evening into a narrative about comeback and redemption that would have changed the pressure on Baker in ways Lepine judged unhelpful. He wanted Baker to play in a room of people who had come to hear jazz, not in a room of people who had come to see whether Chet Baker was finished. The room held 60 people. It was full, but full in the way that the Café de la Paix was often full on a Jazz Thursday, with the regular jazz audience of the left bank, the people who came every week regardless of who was playing because the playing was always worth coming for. A few musicians had heard Baker was back and had come specifically. Most of the audience had no particular investment in the question of whether Baker's career was over. Baker walked onto the small stage with the borrowed trumpet, he had not yet acquired his own, and looked at the rhythm section Lepine had assembled. A French pianist named Alain Goraguer, who was 31 years old and had been playing in Paris clubs for 8 years, and a Belgian bassist and drummer who had worked with various American musicians passing through the city. Baker nodded once, counted in a tempo, and began to play. The first song was My Funny Valentine, which he had been playing since 1954 and which was, by 1960, so identified with him that it functioned as both a musical statement and a declaration of continuity, an announcement that what had existed before the arrest still existed, that the music had survived the prison in the way that the man had survived it. The embouchure was not fully restored. People who were present that evening and who knew Baker's playing well enough to evaluate it technically said later that the sound was thinner than it had been in 1958, the tone lacking some of the fullness that his pre-arrest playing had possessed. But underneath the technical compromise, or perhaps clarified by it, there was something present that the pre-arrest recordings did not always make equally audible. A directness, a quality of necessity in every note that came from playing an instrument that was not yet fully reliable, that required the complete attention of a musician who could not afford to let habit or routine carry any part of the performance. Goraguer, the pianist, said in an interview years later that he had played with many American musicians in Paris and that Baker that Thursday was unlike any of them. He said that most musicians, even great ones, played with a portion of themselves, that some part of their attention was always distributed toward the audience, toward their own self-presentation, toward the professional calculation of how the performance was landing. Baker, he said, played with everything he had simultaneously directed at the music itself. There was nothing left over for anything else. And the effect of this total direction of attention was audible in every bar of every song. The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something is happening that the audience has not been told to expect. Not the polite silence of people waiting for a performance to conclude, but the active silence of people who have stopped doing whatever they were doing because something in the room now requires their full attention. By the end of the second song, nobody at the Café de la Paix was talking. By the end of the third, Lépine, standing at the back of the room with his notebook open and unused, had understood that his judgment had been correct and that the conversation about whether Chet Baker was finished had just ended. It ended not because Baker played that night as he had played in 1958, he did not. It ended because what he played that night demonstrated something more important than the restoration of technical facility. It demonstrated that the musical intelligence and the interior quality that had made the pre-arrest recordings significant were intact. The prison had not reached them. The months without a trumpet had not erased them. They were present in that room in Paris on a Thursday evening in 1960 in a form that was, if anything, more concentrated and less mediated than they had been before, because Baker had nothing left to play with except the essential. The word spread through the Paris jazz community in the way that important musical information has always spread, person to person, musician to musician, the telephone calls and café conversations that constitute the informal critical infrastructure of a serious jazz scene. Within 2 weeks of the Café de la Paix performance, Lépine had bookings confirmed in Brussels, Amsterdam, and Copenhagen. A small French label expressed interest in recording sessions. A German promoter who had heard about the Paris performance from a musician who had been present called to ask about availability for a Frankfurt engagement. Musicians who had been skeptical, and there were many, including several who had known Baker before the arrest, and who had followed the trajectory of his decline with the resigned familiarity of people watching something they had expected, began revising their assessments after hearing the Paris reports. Not all of them, and not immediately. The skepticism that had accumulated around Baker over a decade of unreliability did not dissolve in a single Thursday evening, but the specific skepticism about whether he was capable of playing at a level that justified professional bookings, that skepticism was addressed in the Café de la Paix in the spring of 1960 as directly and completely as it could have been addressed. By the end of 1960, Baker had played in 8 European cities and recorded the first of what would become a substantial catalog of European recordings. The American jazz press covered his return cautiously, acknowledging the comeback without fully revising the narrative of decline that had been established around the arrest. It would take several more years and several more strong recordings before the American critical establishment caught up with what the European jazz world had understood on a Thursday evening in Paris in the spring of 1960. That understanding was simple and complete, that Chet Baker was not finished because the thing that made Chet Baker worth listening to was not located in his reputation or his record deal or his standing in the American jazz hierarchy. It was located in what happened when he raised a trumpet to his lips in a room where people had gathered to listen. And that the prison had not touched. If the story of what Chet Baker rebuilt in Europe, and what Europe understood before America did, stayed with you. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to hear that the most important things cannot be taken by arrest or incarceration or the unanimous verdict of people who have decided you are finished. Have you ever rebuilt something from zero in a place that gave you a chance your home wouldn't? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to explore more stories about the musicians who found in exile the space to become exactly what they had always been.